first ever 8-meg game, the ultimate in gameplay.
The Sega Genesis had a hell of a great run. During the fourth generation of gaming, Sega shot up from the role of underdog to arguably become the leader of the video game market in the West. Much as the terms Nintendo and video game had become synonymous throughout the 80s thanks to the NES, the same could be said of the word Sega throughout the 90s, thanks almost entirely to the unexpected success of Sega's newest home console. With the help of Sonic the Hedgehog and a very savvy and aggressive marketing campaign, the Sega of the 1990s was not only able to put a dent in Nintendo's chokehold on the American games market, but actually usurp them as the leader of the industry. Part of what made 90s Sega stand out when compared to the competition was the sort of irreverent devil-may-care attitude they depicted in much of their media and marketing. If Nintendo was the slightly uptight but well-mannered Catholic schoolboy, then Sega was the snarky, rebellious, leather jacket-wearing middle schooler who swiped his dad's cigarettes. But as time went on, and during the shift from 4th gen to 5th gen gaming, we started to realize that the stuffy Catholic kid actually really had his stuff together, while the cool, rebellious smoker was making a lot of frankly questionable life choices. Between the Sega CD underperforming, the 32X flopping, and the slow US sales of the Saturn, the state of mid-90s Sega was not exactly ideal. Despite the Saturn's more than adequate arcade-quality 3D graphics, consumers largely flocked to newcomer Sony's PlayStation instead. And when the Nintendo 64 finally launched in 1996, this drew another wedge into Sega's sales numbers. By the end of that year, Sega had apparently already resigned themselves to defeat in the console race, as there were already murmurs throughout the company about work on their next console, acting as both the Saturn's successor and replacement. And all the while, the Genesis was still somehow outselling Saturn in total game sales. Trying to make the most of a bad situation, Sega would continue to contract third-party developers to make new games for their older consoles, among such including a new Sonic title, as well as a sequel to a game that had proved to be a moderate hit in 1995, VectorMan. The first VectorMan was conceived as a response to Nintendo's Donkey Kong Country, with its state-of-the-art pre-rendered graphics. And when the first VectorMan proved to be a critical hit, a sequel was greenlit almost immediately. With the VectorMan sequel and the new Sonic title releasing around the same time, Sega hoped the two would generate enough interest to get them through the 1996 holiday season, as well as perhaps push people back into Sega's camp and under the Saturn's tent, before it was too late. VectorMan 2 sees our titular hero, fresh off his heroic defeat of Warhead in the last game, dropped into action again when his sludge barge is shot down by a missile while in orbit. Parachuting to Earth's surface, he finds the planet overrun by monstrous insects, seemingly run by a larger hive mind. It's up to VectorMan to locate and defeat the insect queen to once again save the Earth from disaster. Gameplay is much the same as the first game, having been built on the same engine. VectorMan controls and moves exactly the same, with a basic shot that can be fired in 8 directions and a double jump that also doubles as a makeshift melee attack. Each level still operates on a time limit, and all the multiplier power-ups are still here too. Morphs return from the last game, but as the instruction manual even points out, they are now level-specific, as opposed to being standard pickups. Only 2 morphs are carried over from the first game, the parachute, here called helicopter, and the drill, now called tornado. For the other morphs, VectorMan will transform into a tank or don a pair of rollerblades. There are still a variety of upgrades you can pick up to grant temporary boosts to VectorMan's weapon. There's 5 different kinds here, same as the last game, but a few have been swapped out for new ones. For example, the wave beam that travels through walls has been replaced with a new pulse shot that fires dispersed projectiles, and the first game's nucleus shield is now an assimilation power-up instead. Assimilations are entirely new to VectorMan 2. Certain enemies, upon defeat, drop assimilation tokens that allow VectorMan to take the form of that enemy and use their abilities. The Scorpion assimilation grants him a powerful tail stinger as well as immunity to lava hazards. The Rhino Beetle allows him to charge through enemies and weak walls. The Fire Ant allows him to shoot fireballs. The Shell Bug grants him temporary invincibility, although he still experiences knockback. And the Tick grants him a powerful punching move, at the expense of his usual ranged shots. Bonus stages no longer require you to scour the levels for generators and satellite dishes to destroy. Instead, VectorMan will be sent to one of 3 different bonus rounds if the player can manage to collect around 80% of a level's photons or power sacks, this game's version of the first game's monitors. Which of the 3 stages you get simply depends on how far into the game you are, and each stage harkens back to classic arcade titles. Early in the game, the bonus rounds will be side-scrolling bullet hells. The middle stages will send you to an open map where the goal is to collect floating collectibles orbiting around various planetoids, and the later levels bonus rounds are just Space Invaders. Aside from simply building your score and granting 1-ups, the bonus rounds this time can also randomly spawn max health upgrades to grant VectorMan more total hit points, allowing the player more opportunities to max out their gauge if they happen to miss the ones hidden in the base levels. VectorMan 2, by the end of it all, feels very much like more of the same. There are more levels this time, which here are referred to as scenes instead of days, but the levels themselves are shorter, less expansive, and more linear on average. The time limits for each one are far more reasonable, perhaps too reasonable, and where collecting all photons and power sacks in one level was a genuine challenge in the first game, here I was pulling it off first try on nearly every other level. Or at least I would've, if not for the one power sack I missed because it was placed just out of frame. And yes, that happened several times. In the first VectorMan, balancing your time limits with the number of collectibles and alternate pathways per level made for an ever-present challenge in all but a few levels. And while VectorMan 2 does still provide enough difficulty to encourage the repeat practice and gradual learning curve that I loved about the first game, as a whole it all just seemed way easier this time. There are less morphs this time, which is made up for by the new assimilation powers, but I'm pretty sure you only use the helicopter morph once, and yet both the tank and rollerblade morphs are given 3 or 4 levels entirely to themselves that all seem practically indistinguishable from one another. It all started to make a lot more sense to me once I learned that VectorMan 2 was rushed out the door to meet its deadline. Being a last-minute release for a console that had long been on its last legs, I suppose that isn't surprising. To be quite honest, it was something I already suspected when I booted up the game and saw this bare-bones title screen pop up with no build-up or fanfare. It almost felt like a placeholder. The intro cutscene is more cinematic than the simple text narration of the first game, but the game's ending is a giant nothing burger and feels rushed. A lot of the things that stuck out to me about VectorMan 2 made a lot more sense under this context. The simpler level layouts were the result of the devs having less time to design intricate maps. The removal of the wave gun power-up might be because the game designers realized that the more straightforward levels meant there were almost no instances where firing through walls would actually be of any use. The simpler bonus round criteria and easier to obtain max health upgrades were likely born of the level designers not having the time to come up with clever hiding spaces for collectibles. And in fact, they even shoved 3 max health upgrades into the same level, all basically right next to each other. While I said earlier that this game felt overall less strenuous than the first, the difficulty curve is still all over the place, with the level I spent the most retries on actually being the 3rd level out of the game's total 22. Scene 3 sees the player jumping back and forth between the branches of giant trees as they try to reach the goal at the top of the level, and while that's a very simple premise in theory, the level is chock full of enemies that can knock you off the platforms, and one bad fall can potentially mean starting all the way over from ground level again. And to make it even worse, the enemies in the level respawn every time you go off screen. I spent the better part of an hour climbing the same trees again and again, only to have the same 2 or 3 groups of enemies inevitably knock me down over and over, and it was by far the most frustrating experience of the game. But then when I finally made it past that level, I never experienced that amount of hardship again. The rest of the levels had their challenging moments, sure, but much of the middle and end portion of the game is made up of dedicated rollerblade and tank levels, which are more about spectacle than raw challenge, which results in a game where it feels like the difficulty curve is upside down. VectorMan 2 does take strides to make minor improvements on the first game, but for every step forward it takes another one back, resulting in a game that overall feels like it's just as good as the first game, instead of being outright better than the first game. Tragically, VectorMan 2's rushed nature also resulted in some major game-breaking bugs, and I'm not talking about the literal insects you're shooting. At the end of one level late in the game, there was some major glitch with the game's RAM, and it completely froze, rendering me unable to move on. I ended up having to use the level select cheat to finish, and unlike the first game, this one doesn't lock you out of the ending for using cheats, so I suppose it wasn't a huge deal, but if the game weren't so rushed, the devs would have been able to iron out major issues like these. VectorMan 2 would only initially see release in North America, as by late 1996, that was the only region where the Genesis still had any real mainstream relevance. It, alongside Sonic 3D Blast, would be one of the last titles ever released for the console. At least until Ancient releases Eartheon later this year. I believe in you, Yuzo Koshiro. At this tail-end stage of the Genesis's lifespan, many of the games still being made for the console were shallow, cheap, licensed tie-in games, and this resulted in critics seeing first-party SEGA games like Sonic and VectorMan as somewhat refreshing. Critics largely praised the game for pushing the Genesis to its technical limits, although they overall thought it was a weaker product than its predecessor, and it also wasn't compared favorably to the Donkey Kong Country sequels, which were its main competition from Nintendo. Critics made note of the game's smaller and less complex level layouts, and some also expressed distaste for the sequel's organic enemies and environments when compared to the first game's robotic futurism. Still, it was awarded Genesis Game of the Year by EGM, and GamePro claimed that it proved that 16-bit gaming wasn't dead yet. VectorMan 2's region-locked release, combined with its relatively positive reception, means that it remains a pretty pricey find to this day. I mean, it's not the most outrageous aftermarket prices I've seen, but paying $50 for a Genesis game in 2025 is still kinda nuts, right? It has also been included in several collections for those looking for a more budget-conscious option. Its first ever re-release was as an unlockable bonus game in Sonic Gems Collection in 2005. But it would later also be included in Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection in 2009, and most recently in 2022 as part of the Sega Genesis Mini 2. While we would never get a VectorMan 3, there were plans to make one. Several plans over the years, in fact, but all of them would be cancelled for one reason or another. Leaked documents from SEGA of the time suggest that the earliest plans for a third VectorMan game would have been as a Genesis and Game Gear title in 1997, but nothing is known about these projects, how far they got into development, or even whether development started at all, nor why they were cancelled. But soon after VectorMan 2 came out, BlueSky would pitch another sequel for the Sega Saturn, a 2.5D platformer titled VectorMan Ultra. However, due to the shaky sales of the Saturn, Sega allowed their partnership with BlueSky to lapse as a part of cutting the company's spending budget, and as a result, the sequel's development was halted. A second attempt would arise in 2000, planned for the Sega Dreamcast. By this point, many employees of BlueSky had left to form their own company, V-Blank, and when they approached Sega about working together, they were sent a list of IPs Sega was interested in reviving, among which included VectorMan. However, when V-Blank's pitch, VectorMan Neo, was shown to Sega, they rejected it, citing that they simply didn't see VectorMan as a recognizable or marketable name anymore. So, just to recap, Sega specifically cited VectorMan as an IP they were interested in reviving, and then almost immediately claimed that VectorMan was not an IP worth reviving. Got it. In 2003, Sega would finally officially announce a third VectorMan game for the PS2, developed by Pseudo Interactive. This is the one that made it the furthest into development, even receiving a showcase at the 2003 E3. It was a fully 3D action game that played like a third-person shooter, with platforming drastically downplayed in favor of straight-up run-and-gun, complete with destructible environments and over 24 different weapons and upgrades planned. The trailer was well-received, with the press comparing it to both Halo and Ratchet & Clank, with enemy AI and a physics engine that were fairly ahead of their time. Although, certain publications were less enthusiastic about the major redesign given to the game's main character, which was seen as too derivative. In fact, internally, the dev team even referred to the new VectorMan as Vector Chief, in reference to Halo's famous lead character that he very clearly resembled. While VectorMan 3 was slated for a 2004 release date, it wouldn't actually make it much further past that E3, since the game was soon cancelled as a side effect of major restructuring within Sega of Japan. No further attempts at a VectorMan sequel have ever been attempted, and the nebulous third VectorMan game seems almost cursed. Every attempt at making the game ended in disaster for the dev studio involved, with both BlueSky and V-Blank going out of business after their projects were scrapped. Pseudo Interactive was also crippled by the sudden cancellation, and although they avoided bankruptcy by signing a deal with Microsoft, they too would eventually go defunct in 2008. As it stands, the VectorMan duology remains as a sort of time capsule for the era and culture in which it was cultivated. As I mentioned in my VectorMan 1 video, and speaking as someone raised in 1990s America, that game just oozes the vibes of that specific country in that specific point in time, and VectorMan 2 isn't much different in that regard. And in many ways, that could be said of the Sega Genesis as a whole. It was a product that really only could have thrived at that particular time and place. I mean, just look at the Genesis's American and European sales numbers when compared to the Japanese ones. The Genesis was a product of its time. I feel like in the modern day, people just remember it as the Sonic console, and I'll be honest, this video series hasn't really pushed against that narrative as much as I would have liked, but in its day, it really was a juggernaut with a wide variety of games and genres that allowed it to legitimately go toe-to-toe with the Big N, and very nearly win. With these videos about Sonic 3D Blast and VectorMan 2, we close the curtain on the Sega Genesis for this channel, and now we also do so for the Sega Game Gear, with the final Sonic game released for the handheld. If only they could have gone out on a higher note. Sonic Blast sees our hero once again working to thwart the plans of Dr. Eggman, who, upon trying to fire a death laser at Sonic while he naps, hits a Chaos Emerald by accident, shattering it into 5 pieces. The two take off in a race to collect and reassemble the broken emerald. Oh, and Knuckles is here too, I guess. He was just sitting there behind a palm tree and saw it all happen, and then he was like, okay, yeah, sure. Like, that's literally the plot from the game's manual. Great stuff here. Real compelling and rich. Sonic Blast plays much like the previous Sonic games on Game Gear in that it's a simplified version of the console titles. This game allows you to play as either Sonic or Knuckles, making this the first Game Gear Sonic game that has a fully playable Knuckles, outside of the racing game at least. Knuckles can glide and climb, whilst Sonic can double jump, and some levels even contain character-specific interactables that require these skills in order to open gates or solve puzzles. There are a total of 5 zones to complete, each with 2 acts and a boss, and each zone here is named after a different color. Special stages can be entered by locating giant rings hidden in the stages, Sonic 3 style, although only Act 2 will grant you the Chaos Emerald. Act 1 simply rewards you with a 1-up. For the first time on Game Gear, each emerald is actually a different color in this game, matching that of the current zone name. Which is actually kind of funny because the plot of this game has 1 emerald breaking into 5 pieces, so they totally could have gotten away with just having every emerald be the same color like usual. And in fact, it now makes less sense that they're all different colors, but oh well. Sonic Blast also features the long-awaited Game Gear return of the Shield power-up, which appeared in the Game Gear Sonic 1 and nothing else since. Super Sonic also makes his first and only Game Gear appearance, albeit as little more than an Easter egg, as one of the possible pictures the end-of-act signpost can land on, which will grant the player 30 rings and a 1-up. Now, probably the first thing you've noticed about this game is that it's ugly. Like, really ugly. A smeary, pixelated mess with oversized character sprites moving at like 3 frames per second. Sonic Blast uses pre-rendered 2D sprites, a technique that only barely looked good on 16-bit consoles, and here they are trying to pull it off on an 8-bit handheld. This, folks, is the effect Donkey Kong Country had on this industry for years. You see this? This right here? Look at it. Look at it. Was it worth it? Only exacerbating the absolutely horrendous sprite work is that the pre-rendered visuals meant every character and enemy was made several times bigger here, resulting in some serious screen crunch in a series of games that already suffered from screen crunch. You quite literally can't see 3 feet in front of you here, resulting in countless instances of the player taking damage from hazards they weren't given proper time to react to. Every graphical asset feels like it takes up the exact same amount of screen space, so much so that even the so-called giant rings that take you to the special stage are barely any larger than the standard rings. The visual design and aesthetic of this game is so poorly executed that it actually negatively impacts the gameplay itself, and I don't know, man, when things get to that point, maybe the game devs should reconsider whether or not their chosen aesthetic is the right choice in the first place. Granted, it's not like this game is particularly difficult. In Japan, it was released under the Kids Gear line of Game Gear titles, which was a collection of games designed to be simple and painless in order to cater specifically to young children. Sure, the enemies may follow Mega Man respawn rules where they reappear as soon as you scroll the screen too far, but here that's actually a good thing, since rebounding your jumps off of enemies is sometimes required to reach certain high platforms. In this game, you only lose 10 rings when hit, meaning your ring count can almost be treated as a literal health gauge. And not only are there fewer levels in total, but levels themselves are far smaller and less dense than prior games, even when comparing just the Game Gear Sonic games. I'm just as willing to attribute that to the game's pre-rendered assets, likely taking up significantly more cartridge space, but the more lax level layouts do also contribute to the game's milder difficulty. There was a noticeable difficulty spike at Blue Marine Zone, caused by a combination of switch puzzles with the usual time limits associated with underwater segments in Sonic games, and I spent probably the better part of an hour trying to figure things out there. The final zone also features the dreaded teleporter maze gimmick, which I can't imagine anyone figuring out organically without a walkthrough, map, or a hell of a lot of free time on their hands, since the extra tight screen space means you can never quite seem to get a grasp on the level's overall layout. Sonic Blast received a Master System port as well, and while that version did take some strides to resolve a few of the issues I've brought up here, it also introduced several new ones. Unlike a lot of the previous 8-bit Sonic games, which were developed for the Master System first and then downsized to fit on Game Gear, they actually did the reverse here. I don't know exactly why, but I think it might have something to do with the Game Gear's extended color palette. Sonic Blast was not at all optimized for the Master System's higher resolution and wider aspect ratio, resulting in menus, title cards, and special stages not fitting the entire screen, with just a border lazily tacked on to fill the space. The game's HUD also wasn't adjusted to make up the difference, so the player's ring count is just kinda hanging out in the center of the screen instead of in the corner where it belongs. Not to mention, certain inaccessible test assets that would normally be hidden just off-screen on the Game Gear are now visible in plain sight. It's just a mess of a port, but I guess if you want to play a version of the game that gives you more than half a foot of viewing distance at a time, you'll at least get that. Yeah, the game isn't great, if you couldn't tell by now. Aside from being an affront to human eyes, the game is super generic and brings absolutely nothing new to the standard Sonic formula. Even the title sounds generic. Sonic Blast was apparently the original title for Sonic 3D Blast, and was clearly used as a sort of cross-promotion with that game. I suppose it's better than the Japanese title at least, which is G Sonic. 'Cause what does that even mean?
What does the G stand for? I don't know.
Yes, I am a millennial. I am sorry. Much as I try to remain largely positive on this channel and give every game its fair credit when I can, Sonic Blast is kind of an embarrassing game. I'm not going to hold it against the developers or anything, I'm sure they were doing the best with what they were given, but I can't think of a single thing that would make this game worth playing outside of the novelty of just saying you've done so. Sonic Blast has had a pretty awful reputation from day one, starting with the terrible first impression of its graphics, and only justified by how dull and lifeless the game feels. It's like a paint-by-numbers Sonic game. It has all the usual tropes and themes you'd expect, but without any clever twists or spins, and a severe lack of anything resembling passion or charm. The most tragic thing is just how little there is to say about this game, and after Sonic Triple Trouble showed so much promise for the 8-bit Sonic games, it's a shame that the Game Gear Sonic titles had to end with such a wet fart. And so, with no more SNES or Genesis games remaining on my list, this video well and truly marks our farewell to the 4th generation of gaming, a generation that some might see as one of the most historically significant for the industry. It was the era where company dynamics shifted, where Nintendo was finally given a run for their money, and that competition paved the way for future companies like Sony and Microsoft to throw their hats into the ring. While there are plenty of SEGA fans who will defend consoles like the Saturn and Dreamcast to their last breath, hi, it's me, I'll defend the Dreamcast till my last breath, there's no denying that in terms of both profits and public opinion, 4th gen SEGA was the company's golden era. With the Genesis, SEGA proved that Nintendo wasn't invincible, they weren't untouchable. SEGA proved that you could stand up to the industry's biggest name and come out the other side still swinging. Our hats off to you, Genesis. You had a hell of a great run.